The deaf girl was to be hanged for a crime. She didn't commit until a silent gunslinger claimed her. The rope swayed in the morning breeze, casting shadows across the dusty ground of Copper Ridge's main street. A crowd had gathered despite the early hour, their faces etched with the peculiar mixture of morbid curiosity and righteous satisfaction that only a public execution could inspire. The wooden platform creaked under the weight of 3 men, the sheriff, the preacher, and the executioner, while a 4th figure stood apart, hands bound behind her back. She was barely 20, with auburn hair that caught the first rays of sunlight filtering through the desert haze. What struck the onlookers most was not her youth or the defiant tilt of her chin, but the way her eyes moved constantly, scanning faces, reading lips, catching every gesture and expression with an intensity that made some in the crowd shift uncomfortably. She could not hear their whispered judgments, their calls for justice, or the preacher's droning words about divine retribution, but she could see it all, every cruel smile, every satisfied nod, every person who had already decided her guilt. The crime that brought her to this moment had shocked the small mining town to its core. 3 nights ago, old Jeremiah Hutchins, the wealthiest man in 3 counties, had been found dead in his study, a knife protruding from his back. His safe had been emptied of nearly $8,000 in gold and silver coins, a fortune that represented the life savings of half the town's miners who had entrusted their earnings to his private bank. The evidence against her seemed overwhelming. She had been the last person seen entering Hutchins' house that evening, having worked there for 2 years as a housemaid despite her disability. More damning still, a witness claimed to have seen her leaving through the back door near midnight, clutching what appeared to be a heavy bag. When the sheriff searched her modest room above the bakery the next morning, he found $300 in gold coins hidden beneath her mattress, money she could never have earned honestly on a maid's wages. The trial, if it could be called that, had lasted less than 4 hours. Judge Cornelius Harper, a man whose interpretation of frontier justice leaned heavily towards swift resolution over careful deliberation, had appointed a defense attorney who seemed more interested in the bottle of whiskey in his coat pocket than in representing his client. The prosecution painted a clear picture: a desperate young woman with access to the victim's home, motive provided by her precarious financial situation, and physical evidence that spoke louder than any testimony. Her inability to speak in her own defense had sealed her fate. The court-appointed interpreter, a nervous clerk from the land office who knew only basic hand signals, struggled to convey even simple questions and answers. When asked to explain the money found in her possession, she had gestured frantically, her hands forming shapes and movements that told a story no one in that courtroom could understand or seemed particularly interested in learning. Now, as Sheriff Marcus Donovan adjusted the noose around her neck, she felt the coarse hemp against her skin and wondered if her final moments would pass in the same silence that had defined her entire life. The crowd pressed closer, eager for the spectacle they had risen early to witness. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders, vendors sold coffee and sweet rolls as if this were a county fair, and the more enterprising citizens had placed bets on whether she would struggle or go quietly to her fate. The sheriff stepped back and reached for the lever that would open the trapdoor beneath her feet. His hand paused for a moment as he looked into her eyes, searching perhaps for some sign of remorse or fear. He found neither. Instead, he saw something that made him uncomfortable, a clarity that suggested innocence, a dignity that seemed out of place on a gallows platform. Just as his fingers closed around the wooden handle, a sound cut through the morning air that made every person in the crowd freeze. It was the distinctive crack of a Winchester rifle, followed immediately by the metallic ping of a bullet striking the bell tower of the church across the street. The shot had come from somewhere behind the crowd, and its message was unmistakable, a warning that carried the weight of lethal precision. The crowd turned as one, necks craning to locate the source of the shot. What they saw emerging from the morning shadows at the far end of Main Street was a figure that seemed to have stepped from the pages of a dime novel. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet and 3 inches, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorframe and a stride that spoke of absolute confidence. His black hat was pulled low over his face, casting shadows that made it impossible to read his expression. But his posture and the way he carried himself left no doubt about his profession. A gun belt rode low on his hips, supporting two Colt .45 revolvers in holsters that showed the wear of constant use. The leather had been oiled and maintained with the care of a man whose life depended on the speed of his draw, and the way the weapons sat suggested they were as much a part of him as his own hands. His boots, spurred and dusty from long travel, struck the hard-packed earth with the rhythm of someone who had covered many miles to reach this moment. As he drew closer, details became clearer. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked by lines that spoke of years spent under open skies. A scar ran along his left jaw, pale against his tanned skin, while his eyes remained hidden beneath the brim of his hat. Most remarkably, he had not spoken a word since his arrival, communicating only through the language of his rifle shot and his measured approach. Sheriff Donovan's hand had moved instinctively to his own weapon, but something about the stranger's demeanor gave him pause. This was not the desperate charge of an outlaw or the reckless bravado of a drunk cowhand. There was purpose in every step, calculation in every movement, and an air of authority that commanded respect, even from those who might oppose him. The crowd parted without being asked, creating a clear path down the center of the street. Conversations died to whispers, then to complete silence broken only by the jingle of spurs and the soft creak of leather. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, their earlier excitement replaced by wide-eyed attention to the unfolding drama. When the stranger reached the base of the gallows platform, he stopped and slowly raised his head, allowing the morning sun to illuminate his face for the first time. His features were strong and angular, with high cheekbones and a firm jaw that suggested both determination and integrity. His eyes, revealed at last, were the pale blue of winter sky, and they held a depth of experience that spoke of battles fought and won, of justice served in places where law was nothing more than the resolve of good men to stand against evil. For a long moment, he and the sheriff regarded each other, two representatives of different approaches to frontier justice. Donovan was a man of procedures and public office, accountable to the townspeople who had elected him, and bound by the decisions of duly appointed judges. The stranger represented something older and more personal, the code of the West that said a man's word was his bond, and that sometimes the right thing required stepping outside the boundaries of written law. "Sheriff?" the stranger said finally, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air, despite its quiet tone. "I have something to say about this proceeding." Donovan shifted uncomfortably, acutely aware of the crowd's attention and the delicate balance of authority in this moment. "This is a lawful execution, stranger. The court has spoken, and justice will be served." The gunslinger nodded slowly, as if considering this response. "Justice," he repeated, testing the word. "That's a fine thing when it's actually what's being served." He stepped closer to the platform, his movement fluid and unhurried. "But I've got reason to believe you're about to hang an innocent woman." A murmur ran through the crowd at these words. Judge Harper, who had positioned himself near the front to witness the culmination of his swift justice, stepped forward with visible irritation. "Now, see here," he began, his voice carrying the pompous authority of his office. "This woman has been tried and convicted according to law. We don't need some drifter coming into our town and—" He stopped speaking abruptly, as the stranger's pale eyes fixed on him with an intensity that was almost physical. There was something in that gaze that suggested challenging this man further might prove to be an extremely poor decision. "Your Honor," the gunslinger said, his tone remaining respectful despite the steel beneath it, "I'm not here to question your authority or your court. I'm here because I have information that bears on this case." He reached slowly into his coat pocket, mindful of the sheriff's twitchy gun hand, and withdrew a folded paper. "3 days ago, I was tracking a man named Cole Brennan through the desert south of here. Brennan's wanted for bank robbery in Arizona territory, and there's a $500 bounty on his head." He unfolded the paper, revealing a wanted poster bearing the image of a hard-faced man with dark hair and calculating eyes. "Brennan's been working with a partner, hitting small towns and mining camps. Their pattern is always the same. They identify the local money man, study his habits, then strike when the opportunity presents itself." Sheriff Donovan descended from the platform to examine the poster, his expression growing troubled as he studied the image. "I've never seen this man in Copper Ridge," he said carefully. "You wouldn't have," the stranger replied. "Brennan's smart. He sends his partner in first to scout the target, and establish an inside connection. The partner's a woman, young, pretty, desperate enough to take risks for the promise of easy money. He paused, letting this information settle over the crowd. 3 nights ago, I tracked them to a camp about 15 miles south of here. Found evidence they'd been there for at least a week, planning something big. Judge Harper scoffed loudly. Suppositions and wild theories, he declared. We have a confession of sorts. The girl was found with stolen money in her possession. The gunslinger's expression didn't change, but something in his stance suggested the judge's dismissal had been noted and would be remembered. Planted evidence, he said simply. Brennan's partner would have hidden that money in the girl's room to throw suspicion off themselves while they made their escape with the real prize. And where is this mysterious partner? Donovan asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to entertain doubts about the case he had built. Dead, the stranger replied bluntly. I found her body yesterday morning, shot through the heart. Brennan doesn't leave loose ends. He reached into another pocket and produced a small leather pouch, heavy with coins. This was hidden near the body, part of Hutchins' money still in the bank's stamped bags. The crowd pressed closer as Donovan examined the evidence, their mood shifting from bloodthirsty anticipation to uncertain murmuring. On the gallows platform, the young woman watched the proceedings with intense attention, her eyes moving from face to face as she tried to piece together the conversation through lip reading and gesture. Even if what you say is true, Judge Harper interjected, his voice rising with frustration, it doesn't prove this girl's innocence. She could still have been working with these criminals. The stranger turned to face the judge directly, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute certainty. She couldn't have been working with them, he said, and I can prove it. He stepped closer to the gallows platform, close enough that the bound woman could see his face clearly. For the first time since his arrival, he looked directly at her, and something passed between them. A moment of communication that transcended words or sound. Slowly, deliberately, the gunslinger raised his hands and began to move them in the fluid, expressive patterns of sign language. His fingers formed words and concepts with practiced ease, telling a story that only one person in that crowd could understand. The woman's eyes widened with shock, then filled with tears, as she realized that someone, finally, was speaking her language. I know sign language, the stranger said to the crowd, while his hands continued their silent conversation. Learned it from a deaf cavalry scout during the Apache campaigns. This woman is telling me about the night Hutchins died. He paused in his signing to address the crowd. She says she left work at her usual time, around 8 o'clock that evening. She went directly to the boarding house where she lives, had dinner with the other residents, and went to bed early because she had a headache. His hands moved again, and the woman responded with rapid, passionate gestures that spoke of desperation and fear. She says the next morning, she found the money hidden in her room, wrapped in one of her own handkerchiefs. She had never seen it before and couldn't understand where it came from. When the sheriff arrived to search her room, she tried to explain through gestures, but no one understood what she was trying to say. Sheriff Donovan looked from the stranger to the woman and back again, uncertainty clear in his expression. How do we know you're translating accurately? How do we know this isn't some elaborate deception? The gunslinger nodded, as if he had expected this question. Fair point, Sheriff, but there's something else you need to know. He reached into his saddlebags, which he had retrieved from his horse, and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. This belonged to Brennan's partner. Found it on her body. He opened the journal and began to read. Entry for 3 weeks ago. Arrived in Copper Ridge. Target identified. Jeremiah Hutchins, private banker. Keeps large sums in his home safe. Studying his household routines. He flipped pages. 2 weeks ago. Hutchins employs a deaf girl as housemaid. Perfect patsy. Can't defend herself. Already viewed with suspicion by townsfolk. Will plant evidence in her room after the job. The crowd's murmur grew louder, a sound of growing unrest and shifting opinion. On the platform, the woman continued to sign frantically, her bound hands making small, desperate movements. The stranger translated her words. She's asking why no one believed her. She's asking why being deaf made everyone think she was also stupid or criminal. His voice carried a note of anger now, the first real emotion he had shown. She's asking if she's going to die because she can't scream her innocence loud enough for you to hear. Judge Harper stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. This is highly irregular, he declared. "We cannot overturn a lawful conviction based on the word of some drifter and a journal that could have been forged." "You're right," the stranger agreed, surprising everyone. "My word alone wouldn't be enough in a court of law." He pulled out another item from his saddlebags, a small silver locket on a chain. "But this might be." He opened the locket to reveal a miniature photograph of an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. This belonged to Brennan's partner. It's a picture of her father, a man she clearly loved despite the path she chose. He closed the locket and held it up. Jeremiah Hutchins wore a locket exactly like this one. His daughter gave it to him before she died of consumption 5 years ago. Sheriff Donovan's face went pale. "Hutchins was found without his locket," he said slowly. "We assumed it had been taken with the money." "It was," the stranger confirmed, "by the real killer, who took it as a trophy. Brennan's partner must have convinced him to let her keep it." He pocketed the locket carefully. "I'll wager if you check Hutchins' personal effects, you'll find a description of this exact piece." The crowd was growing restless now, voices rising in confusion and anger. Some called for the hanging to proceed as planned, unwilling to admit they might have been wrong. Others demanded that the woman be released immediately, their bloodlust transforming into protective outrage on her behalf. In the midst of this chaos, the stranger did something that silenced everyone. He walked to the base of the gallows platform, and in full view of the crowd, slowly removed his gun belt and set it on the ground. Then he climbed the steps to stand beside the bound woman. "My name is Samuel Carter," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the crowd. "I've been a lawman, a bounty hunter, and a soldier. I've seen enough injustice in my life to recognize it when it's about to happen." He looked directly at Judge Harper. "This woman is innocent of the crime you're about to hang her for. I stake my life on that fact." He turned to address the crowd. "I know what you're thinking. Why should you trust the word of a stranger? Why should you let doubt creep in when you've already decided on guilt?" His pale eyes swept over the faces below. "But I'll ask you this. When did you last see real evidence of this woman's guilt, beyond the planted money and the word of witnesses who might have been mistaken?" Sheriff Donovan stepped forward, his expression troubled. "Carter, what exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing you delay this execution until we can find Cole Brennan and get the full truth," Carter replied. "I tracked him this far, and I can find him. Give me 3 days. And if you can't," Judge Harper demanded, "if this Brennan doesn't exist or can't be found." Carter looked at the woman beside him, who was following the conversation as best she could through lip reading. Her eyes held a mixture of hope and terror, the expression of someone who had lived her entire life depending on others for understanding, and who had learned not to expect much. "If I can't find Brennan in 3 days," Carter said quietly, "then I'll stand on this platform with her." The crowd erupted at this declaration. Voices raised in argument and debate. Some called him a fool, others a hero. Judge Harper sputtered protests about legal precedent and proper procedure, while Sheriff Donovan looked like a man wrestling with doubts he had tried to suppress. In the midst of all this noise and confusion, Carter turned to the woman and began to sign to her, his hands moving in gentle, reassuring gestures. For the first time since her arrest, she was able to have a real conversation, to express her fears and hopes to someone who could understand. Her hands moved rapidly, telling him about her life in Copper Ridge, her work for Hutchins, the morning she had found the money, and known with sinking certainty that she was being framed. She told him about the trial, about sitting in that courtroom surrounded by people deciding her fate, while she could only watch their lips move in words she could barely decipher. Carter listened with the patience of a man accustomed to hearing difficult truths. When she finished, he signed back to her, and whatever he said brought the first genuine smile she had shown in days. "What did you tell her?" Sheriff Donovan asked, climbing onto the platform to join them. "I told her that being different doesn't make someone guilty," Carter replied, "and that sometimes the right person comes along at the right time." Donovan studied Carter's face, weighing years of law enforcement experience against the evidence before him. Finally, he reached up and loosened the noose around the woman's neck, lifting it over her head. 3 days, he said firmly. "You find this Brennan character and bring him back here, or we finish what we started today." Judge Harper began to protest, but his words were drowned out by the crowd's reaction. Some cheered, others booed, and the general confusion suggested that public opinion was evenly divided between those who wanted to see justice done properly and those who simply wanted to see someone hang. Carter untied the ropes binding the woman's hands, and she immediately began signing her thanks, her movements so rapid and emotional that even he had trouble following them all. He responded with slower, clearer gestures, and gradually she calmed enough for coherent conversation. "What's her name?" Donovan asked. Carter's hands moved in question, and she responded with a simple gesture. "Elizabeth," he translated. "Elizabeth Morrison. She's been in Copper Ridge for 2 years. Came west after her parents died in Ohio." As the crowd began to disperse, Carter helped Elizabeth down from the platform. She walked unsteadily, her legs weak from fear and the proximity of death, but her eyes were clear and determined. Whatever happened in the next 3 days, she was going to face it on her own feet. That afternoon, Carter prepared for what might be his final hunt. He checked his weapons, studied his maps, and provisioned for a hard ride through difficult country. Brennan had a 3-day head start, but Carter had something the outlaw didn't expect: the desperate motivation of a man who had just pledged his life to a stranger's innocence. Elizabeth watched from the boarding house window as he made his preparations. She had been given a room under guard, not quite free, but no longer facing immediate execution. The townspeople didn't know what to make of her now that doubt had been cast on her guilt, so they treated her with a mixture of curiosity and caution that was perhaps no better than their previous hostility, but at least didn't end with a rope. As Carter mounted his horse, she appeared at the window and caught his attention. Her hands moved in sign language, and he responded with a simple nod before turning his horse toward the desert. What she had said was a simple phrase that carried the weight of absolute trust. Bring him back. The trail led south through country that grew more desolate with each mile. Carter followed signs that were days old, the faint impressions of hoof prints in hard ground, disturbed stones that marked a rider's passage, the occasional broken twig that suggested someone had passed through recently. Tracking was as much art as science, requiring patience, intuition, and the ability to think like the man being hunted. Brennan was clever and experienced, but he had made the classic mistake of running toward familiar territory. Carter had studied the wanted posters and reports carefully, and he knew that Brennan favored the broken canyon country along the territorial border, where a man could disappear among the maze of stone formations and hidden water sources. On the second day, Carter found the abandoned camp where Brennan had spent the previous night. The outlaw was pushing his horse hard, probably hoping to reach the relative safety of the Badlands before any pursuit could catch up. What he didn't know was that Carter's horse was fresh and strong, capable of covering ground that would exhaust a mount already driven for 3 days. The final confrontation came at dawn on the 3rd day, in a narrow canyon where ancient floods had carved smooth channels in the red sandstone. Carter had ridden through the night, following a trail that grew fresher with each mile, until he spotted the thin column of smoke that marked Brennan's breakfast fire. The outlaw was a hard-looking man in his 40s, with the lean build and quick eyes of someone who had spent years looking over his shoulder. He was breaking camp when Carter appeared at the mouth of the canyon, his rifle ready but not yet aimed. "Cole Brennan," Carter called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. Brennan dropped his coffee cup and spun toward the sound, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. He stopped when he saw Carter's rifle trained on him, steady and professional. "You've got the advantage," Brennan said carefully. "What do you want?" "I want you to come back to Copper Ridge with me," Carter replied. "There's an innocent woman about to hang for your crime." Brennan laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Innocent? That little deaf girl? She was the perfect patsy, couldn't talk her way out of anything even if she wanted to." The admission hung in the morning air like gun smoke. Carter felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. The familiar sensation that came just before violence became inevitable. "So you admit you killed Jeremiah Hutchins," Carter said. "I admit nothing to you," Brennan replied, his earlier caution replaced by confidence as he assessed the situation. "You're just one man, and I've got friends in this country. Kill me, and you'll never prove that girl's innocence." "I don't need to kill you," Carter said quietly. "I just need to bring you back." What happened next unfolded with the brutal efficiency of men trained in violence. Brennan's hand dropped toward his gun, fast and smooth with the practice of someone who had survived many such encounters. But Carter was faster. his rifle barking once in the confined space of the canyon. Brennan spun and fell, clutching his shoulder, his weapon flying from nerveless fingers to clatter against the stone. Carter approached cautiously, kicking the fallen gun away before kneeling beside the wounded man. "The shoulder's shattered," he said matter-of-factly. "You'll live, but you won't be drawing on anyone for a long time." As he bound Brennan's wound with strips torn from the outlaw's own shirt, Carter felt the weight of time pressing against him. It was the morning of the third day, and Copper Ridge was a hard ride away. If he pushed both horses to their limits, he might make it back before sunset, before Sheriff Donovan felt obligated to keep his word about resuming the execution. The ride back was a nightmare of speed and endurance. Carter had tied Brennan to his saddle, the wounded man conscious but weakened by blood loss and the constant jarring of the hard pace. They stopped only to water the horses and check the prisoner's bonds, then pressed on through the heat of the afternoon. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Carter saw the familiar outline of Copper Ridge's buildings rising from the desert floor. Smoke from cooking fires drifted into the evening air, and the yellow glow of lanterns began to appear in windows as the town settled into its evening routine. They arrived just as the church bell was tolling 6 o'clock, the horses lathered with sweat and barely able to maintain a walk. A crowd had gathered again in the main street, word having spread that this might be the evening when the drama that had gripped their town would finally reach its conclusion. Sheriff Donovan emerged from his office as Carter rode up with his prisoner. The lawman's relief was visible as he saw Brennan slumped in his saddle, wounded but alive and able to speak. "This is Cole Brennan," Carter announced to the crowd. "Wanted for bank robbery in Arizona territory, and the real killer of Jeremiah Hutchins." Judge Harper pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "This proves nothing," he declared. "Just because you've captured some outlaw doesn't mean—" He stopped speaking as Brennan raised his head and looked directly at him. "You want proof?" the wounded man said, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "I killed old Jeremiah 3 nights ago. Stabbed him in the back while he was opening his safe, took every dollar he had saved up." He laughed bitterly. "And I planted $300 in that deaf girl's room to throw suspicion off myself. She never even knew I was there." The crowd erupted in confused voices, anger, relief, embarrassment, and vindication, all mixing together in a cacophony of emotion. Through it all, Carter looked toward the boarding house where Elizabeth waited and saw her face appear at the window, hope and fear warring in her expression. Sheriff Donovan took charge of the prisoner while Doc Peterson tended to his wound. Judge Harper retreated to his office, muttering about irregular procedures and the breakdown of proper legal process. The crowd gradually dispersed, their appetite for spectacle satisfied in a way none of them had expected. As the evening settled into quiet routine, Carter found himself standing outside the boarding house, uncertain of what came next. Elizabeth appeared at the door, no longer under guard, but still wearing the simple dress she had nearly died in. Her eyes met his, and she began to sign rapidly, her hands forming words of gratitude that needed no translation. Carter responded in kind, their silent conversation flowing with an ease that spoke of understanding beyond mere communication. To anyone watching, they might have seemed like old friends reunited, their gestures natural and comfortable despite having met only days before. "What will you do now?" he asked through sign language. Elizabeth's response was immediate and clear. "Live," she signed. "For the first time in days, I can think about living instead of dying." Carter nodded, understanding more than just her words. In saving her life, he had perhaps found something he hadn't realized he was looking for. A purpose beyond the endless cycle of tracking and capturing, a reason to believe that sometimes the system could work for those who couldn't make themselves heard. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above Copper Ridge, 2 people who had been strangers that morning stood together in comfortable silence, united by the experience of justice nearly denied and ultimately served. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight they could rest in the knowledge that sometimes, when the right person appears at the right moment, even the voiceless can find someone to speak for them. The rope that had nearly claimed an innocent life swayed empty in the desert breeze, a reminder of how close they had come to an irreversible mistake. But justice, like truth, has a way of emerging when people are willing to look beyond easy answers and comfortable assumptions. In the end, it had taken a silent gunslinger to ensure that a deaf woman's story was finally heard.